encourage musical talent, where would our future Louis Primas come from?
Those were the words from the wise, well-spoken Betty Rubble. But who is this Louis Prima, you may ask? Well, in this video we'll discuss that, his rise, and his fall. Now, in this video, we won't necessarily be going too much into Prima's childhood. We'll basically just be focusing on his career, mainly his rise and fall, and especially his legacy later on. Now, back during the time when Prima thrived, there were a bunch of household names in pop culture, especially in music. Let's name some. So first off, we have the Beatles, and we have Elvis, and then we have, of course, Bing Crosby, and we have Frank Sinatra. For a while, Louis Prima was in that mix. Now, Prima as a household name may seem pretty apparent, as had he not have been, then Betty Rubble may have mentioned old Blue Eyes himself, Frank Sinatra, and he would have liked that very much. Now, you may be wondering, how did Louis Prima's life start off? Well, it started off with him being born in December of 1910 in New Orleans to a reasonably poor Italian-American family. He was always enamored with music ever since he was a kid, and he always wanted to be a band leader. Louis Prima would, of course, graduate from high school. He wasn't a dropout, but he would soon play for a few gigs. These were unfortunately failures by every sense of the word. And Prima would even play for the Capital steamship titled Capital. He would meet, however, his first... While he was doing this, of course, as I mentioned earlier, he would meet his first wife, Louise Polizzi. And they would be married for a total of 8 years. But it was at this time, around 1933, that Louis Prima would move to New York City, which actually proved to be a big and best business decision for Prima. Yeah, moving to New York was actually very beneficial for Prima, as he'd get involved and start racking up his own band. And soon enough, in 1936, something very, very big would happen to him. 2 words: Benny Goodman. Now, Prima at this point had actually moved to California, and he had a band called the New Orleans Gang. Of course, he was the leader of it. And all one day, he had written a song called Sing, Sing, Sing. Seem familiar to you? Oh, it should. This is a famous hit by Benny Goodman. Thanks to Prima, Benny Goodman had a very, very successful hit that would actually be inducted for a Grammy in 1982. All that happens thanks to Louis Prima.
I know it sounds like Benny Goodman, but don't worry.
Now, also at this point, Louis Prima would end up divorcing with Louise. Being in California, he would eventually meet an actress named Alma Ross. They would eventually fall in love, and then they would get married a few months later. But the only problem is, some secrets about Louis' past weren't shared with Alma, like the fact that Louis had a daughter. He literally didn't share that with her, which is kind of not a good trait for a father. But let's see if this all gets straightened out. Prima was making progress at this point, and after getting a smaller, quote, gang, he started performing back in New York again. And it was at this point when Eleanor Roosevelt noticed him and invited him to FDR's birthday party. And so Prima was in some photos with FDR, which highly boosted his popularity. The war times were very fruitful towards Louis Prima, as he received great financial and critical success during this time. He wasn't actually able to participate in the war due to a knee injury, but he was able to wow audiences, the Army, the Navy, the Marines, and the Air Force with his great singing skills, and he was able to take their mind off of the war for just a couple of minutes, which is very important, especially for their morale. He had such Italian hits such as Angelina, and he was actually finding great success during this time. However, right after the war ended in 1946, Lillian Carroll thought that she could have a solo career without him.
But into her own vault?
And so she left. So that left Prima with a new female singer, Who would that be? I'm sure you know at this point. Now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, Louis was looking for a vocalist to replace Lily and Carol. This would, of course, end up being Keely Smith. How that came to be was Louis Prima was actually holding auditions for the new female vocalist. And, of course, Keely's performance was so wonderful that she just had to be chosen. At this time, Louis actually had to move to Columbia Records, as seen on his microphone, for financial reasons, since the market was changing and he wasn't quite as much of a success anymore, with his biggest hits being Chop Suey Chop Main and songs among those rankings. Meanwhile, in his personal life, he had actually broken up with Alma Ross and married his secretary at the time, Tracelyn Barrett, and they had a kid, and so far, at this point in time, the relationship was going down pretty well. Now, at this point in time, the economy was changing, the world was changing, and tastes in music were changing. And Louis realized this. As teenagers were starting to enjoy rock and roll a little more, he actually condoned it and was actually open-minded towards the young teenagers' interest in rock and roll, saying that he understood that younger kids may want something that they could dance to, at least back then. Ugh. So he sort of started to adapt to the rock and roll era of music while still adhering to his own genre of music. This can be seen on hits such as Pennies from Heaven and I'm Just a Gigolo / I Ain't Got Nobody. Now, things between him and Keely were also heating up a little bit, as he divorced Tracelyn, Prima did, and married Keely, which we all saw coming. But years later, there will be some drama happening.
Did you hear about it? That's like...
Of course, on the stage at this point, everything was going just peachy keen for Louis Prima and Keely Smith. But behind the scenes, although there was the Vegas act, this may have sort of reflected how things were going on in real life. Enter Frank Sinatra. Sinatra, of course, took the world by storm, and Keely was, of course, enamored by Sinatra, just like how every other girl was at the time. Now, this admiration for Sinatra by Keely would go a little far, as she and him would start having an affair. Which makes sense, since Sinatra could basically have any girl in the world that he wanted, especially at that time, and he just happened to have wanted Keely. So, at this point, his newest album at the time, Come Dance With Me, actually had 2 duets by Frank and Keely on them, those being How You Fix for Love and So In Love. Now, obviously, Louis wouldn't have been very happy about this, but there really wasn't much they could do, because this was Frank, and Frank owed the world in terms of music. Now, at this point, the fling between Sinatra and Keely had ended, so you would think that everything was just good, great, and wonderful for Louis and Keely, basically.
Good, sturdy. I feel great. I feel wonderful.
But this, unfortunately, just wasn't the case, as Keely wanted to break up with Louis due to his hard-working life, basically meaning mentally hard-working, in which he basically taxed himself and, unfortunately, inadvertently taxed Keely with his stardom and his fame, with him being a temporary household name at that time. So, Keely would break up with Louis and marry Jimmy Bowen. But what would happen to Louis? He's the subject of this biography, so let's see. Now, at this point, Louis Prima knew that Keely Smith was the missing piece to the puzzle in their group. Now, without the missing piece, it becomes missing again. And he knew this, so he decided to prove that he could go on without Keely. This is done by picking up a new female singer whom he would later marry, Gia Mayone, and he would promote an album of hers called This Is Gia with Prima Records. Now, obviously, Prima Records was a failure, and this album was a failure as well, but the record company itself did have such people in it, such as Willie Nelson, Kenny Rogers, and even Glenn Miller. So you shouldn't really doubt this record company. Nonetheless, it still fails, and Louis Prima was on the downward spiral.
Can be bad, very bad.
Now, of course, as I mentioned earlier, Louis' career was on a downward spiral, and it came to the point where he had to team up with today's evil of evils, Disney. Anyone with a brain will know that today's Disney is truly evil, but if you don't, then I'm sorry. It came to the point where he had to make an album of him singing the soundtrack of Mary Poppins, with him even making Italian supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. And they didn't even spell it right on the cover. This was not good. But a good thing about him was he did play King Louie from The Jungle Book. That may spark some fond memories for some of you that may have watched The Jungle Book, where he had also sang I Wanna Be Like You from that movie. But I believe it came to the point where he also had to make most of the soundtrack for that as well, just to make ends meet in the music industry. From then on, Louis Prima wouldn't do much with his career. After The Jungle Book, he was basically settled, except for a few compilation albums that he would put up every few years. But people say one of his last television appearances was as a guest on famous game show, What's My Line? But unfortunately, there is no factual evidence to back this up, except for one of those, Reddit posts. But you can never really trust those. But if someone does find evidence, please let me or anyone who's involved with these history books know, as I would like to back up this supposed fact. Unfortunately, Louis Prima would die in 1978, but his legacy would live on. Now, after Prima's death, apparently he had set a legacy, as his co-worker Sam Butera and his former wife Keely Smith would continue on the tradition of Prima until both of their respective deaths. And are you wondering why there's a TikTok logo up there? Well, that's because in early 2022, there was a trend where chefs that were at least 20% Italian would use that song in the background while they're preparing Italian meals. This could also be apparent in YouTube Shorts, but it was mostly a TikTok trend. The trend is no longer a thing, but Prima's legacy has obviously carried on for the decades to come.
If you marry the baker boy, he'll have the cannoli in his hand.